Deep in the vast wilderness of northern Montana, the crisp morning air carried an eerie stillness. Margaret Miller, an experienced park ranger, had spent years patrolling these lands, but today, something felt off. Then, a rustling in the distance, she turned her head just in time to see two bear cubs emerge from the trees. Their small frames trembled, but they weren't afraid, they were determined, focused. They moved toward her, not with curiosity, but with purpose. Margaret's instincts screamed at her to step back. Wild animals didn't behave like this. But then, one of the cubs let out a soft, urgent cry. It wasn't a random sound. It wasn't aggression. It was a call for help. What happened next shattered everything she thought she knew about the animal kingdom. This is a story of intelligence, survival, and the unbreakable bond between humans and wildlife. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss an incredible true story like this one. Now, prepare yourself, because this will change the way you see the world forever. The early morning sun filtered through the dense pine trees of northern Montana, painting streaks of gold across the frost-covered forest floor. Margaret Miller adjusted her jacket and radio, inhaling deeply as she began her patrol. This was her routine every day, walking the trails, monitoring the wildlife, protecting the land from poachers and illegal activity. But today, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. Margaret stopped, scanning the trees. Usually, the morning air was filled with birdsong, the rustling of small animals, and the distant calls of elk or wolves. But now, nothing. Just silence. She placed her hand on her belt, where her bear spray and emergency whistle hung. Years of experience had taught her that when the forest goes silent, something is very, very wrong. Then, movement. Margaret turned sharply, her pulse quickening. Two small figures emerged from the brush, their golden-brown fur standing out against the dark green forest. Her heart stopped, two bear cubs, alone. Immediately, Margaret's training kicked in. Cubs alone equaled danger. A mother bear would never leave her young behind. If these cubs were out in the open, something had gone terribly wrong. She instinctively took a slow step back, scanning the tree line for any sign of the mother. But the cubs didn't react as wild animals normally would. They didn't flee. They didn't hesitate. They walked toward her. Margaret's breath caught. They weren't scared, they were asking for something. The larger cub stopped a few feet away, lifting its head and staring directly into Margaret's eyes. And then, in a moment that made her skin prickle with unease, it let out a cry. Not a growl. Not a whimper. A deliberate, urgent sound. Margaret's instincts screamed at her, this wasn't normal. Something was very, very wrong. And against every rule she had ever followed, she made the choice that changed everything. She followed them. Margaret's boots crunched against the frost-covered ground as she hesitated for a moment. Every instinct she had developed over the years as a park ranger screamed at her to turn back. Following wild animals, especially bear cubs, wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous. Yet, something about this felt different. The two cubs weren't just wandering, they were leading her. Margaret let out a slow breath, scanning the area one last time for their mother. Nothing. The cubs stood a few feet ahead, watching her, their eyes dark and expectant. Their tiny paws shifted anxiously in the dirt, as if urging her to move. Margaret swallowed hard. She knew she was breaking protocol. If another ranger had been with her, they'd be calling for backup, setting up perimeters, waiting for the mother to appear. But this wasn't normal bear behavior. She had seen cubs cry out before, but this was different. This was deliberate. Taking a deep breath, Margaret stepped forward. The moment she moved, the cubs reacted. They turned and started walking ahead of her. Not running. Not darting into the woods like scared animals. They were guiding her. Margaret's heart pounded. She adjusted her radio on her shoulder, ready to call for backup if needed. The cubs led her deeper into the forest, weaving through towering pine trees. The deeper they went, the colder it felt. The ground beneath her boots turned from solid earth to frost-covered leaves. The wind whispered between the trees, sending a chill down her spine. Something wasn't right. Then, the smell hit her. Margaret froze. It was faint at first, a metallic, sickly scent that made her stomach twist. Blood. Her hand instinctively went to her bear spray. The cubs kept moving forward. Their little bodies trembled, and suddenly, she wasn't afraid of them anymore, she was afraid of what they were leading her to. Margaret pushed past a thick cluster of bushes, her boots slipping slightly on the cold ground. And then she saw it. Her breath caught. Just ahead, in a small clearing, lay a massive female grizzly bear. But she wasn't moving. Something was wrong. Margaret stepped closer, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the wind. That's when she saw the truth. The bear wasn't just lying there, she was trapped. Metal glinted in the morning light. Margaret's stomach twisted as she took in the scene. Two massive steel traps had snapped shut around the bear's hind legs, their jagged teeth cutting deep into her flesh. Blood had seeped into the dirt beneath her, turning the frost a dark, sickening shade of red. The bear's massive chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. She was still alive, but barely. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't an accident. This was poaching. Someone had set these traps intentionally. And if the cubs hadn't led her here, their mother would have died, slowly, alone, in the freezing woods. Margaret dropped to her knees, pulling out her radio. She didn't hesitate. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Miller," she said, her voice steady despite the anger burning in her chest. "I need immediate backup. We have an injured grizzly trapped by poachers." She looked at the cubs, who had stopped beside their mother, pressing themselves against her fur as if trying to comfort her. Her throat tightened. They had come for her. They had asked for help. And Margaret had just uncovered something far worse than she ever expected. Margaret's fingers tightened around her radio as she repeated the distress call. Static crackled in response. No answer. Her stomach dropped. She was too deep into the forest, the thick canopy and remote location were interfering with the signal. She turned back to the massive grizzly, her eyes scanning the damage. The mother bear's breathing was labored, her body trembling from blood loss and pain. The jagged steel teeth of the traps were sunk deep into her hind legs, and dried blood had started to crust around the wounds. She had been here for hours, maybe longer. The cubs were pressed against her side, their tiny bodies shaking. Margaret exhaled sharply. If she didn't act soon, this bear was going to die. Margaret's mind raced. She had a tranquilizer in her emergency pack, but she knew it wasn't strong enough for an animal this size. Cutting the bear loose by herself was insanely dangerous. Even injured, even weak, a grizzly could kill with a single swipe. But she had no choice. She needed to try something. Margaret slowly reached into her bag, pulling out a flare gun, not to shoot at the bear, but to fire into the sky. Maybe someone would see it. maybe backup would come faster. She aimed straight up and pulled the trigger. A burst of red light shot into the sky, cutting through the morning mist like a beacon. She just had to hope someone saw it. Then she turned back to the mother bear. Margaret knelt a few feet away from the injured bear, her breath slow and steady. The cubs watched her with wide, intelligent eyes. They weren't afraid of her anymore. They had trusted her to follow them here. And now, they were waiting to see what she would do next. Margaret knew the risk. If she got too close, the mother could lash out in pain and fear. If she didn't get close enough, she wouldn't be able to help. The window to save her was closing. Margaret glanced down at the trap, rusted, cruel, the kind used by illegal poachers who didn't care how much an animal suffered. Her fists clenched. She wasn't about to let those monsters win. Margaret pulled out her multi-tool, her fingers steady despite the icy wind biting at her skin. She inched forward, eyes locked on the bear's massive head. Her breath hitched. The bear was watching her, not with aggression, not with fear, just watching. Margaret stopped moving. For a long moment, neither of them moved at all. Then the bear blinked. And as if she understood, as if she knew Margaret was here to help, she stopped struggling. Margaret's chest tightened. This was her chance. She reached for the first trap, her fingers wrapped around the rusted mechanism, feeling the cold bite of metal against her skin. She pressed down as hard as she could. Nothing. Too tight. Too strong. Her arms trembled as she tried again, putting her full weight on the release mechanism. The metal creaked, but it didn't budge. Margaret gritted her teeth. Come on. Come on. She threw her weight against it again. Again. This time, it gave slightly, but not enough. She needed help. Margaret looked at the cubs, her breath heavy. It was insane. Impossible. But they had already proven they understood more than anyone would believe. She reached toward them, moving slowly, and then, softly, she spoke. I need you to push. The cubs stared at her. Margaret motioned toward the trap. She pressed her hands down on the lever again, demonstrating. Then she let go and waited. For one agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then the stronger cub moved. It stepped forward, hesitant, ears flicking back, then pressed its tiny paw against the trap. Margaret's breath caught. The second cub followed. Together, they pressed down. And for the first time, the trap gave way. Margaret didn't hesitate. With one last push, she forced the trap open. The mother bear let out a low, pained grunt, but she didn't attack. She didn't run. She just lay there, exhausted, but free. The cubs let out tiny, urgent cries, pressing against her. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the second trap. This time, she wasn't alone. She knew the cubs understood now. Together, they worked as one. And as the final trap snapped open, Margaret felt something she hadn't in years, a connection. A moment of pure, undeniable proof that animals understood far more than humans ever gave them credit for. And these cubs, they had just saved their mother's life. The metallic snap of the second trap unlocking echoed through the cold morning air. Margaret's breath hung frozen, her hands still gripping the rusted mechanism. She had done it. The mother was free. But she didn't move. Margaret's pulse quickened. She should be trying to stand. She should be running. She should be something. But the grizzly just lay there, her chest rising and falling in slow, labored breaths. The cubs were frantic now, nudging against her, whimpering softly. Margaret pressed a hand to her forehead. She was still losing too much blood. The wounds on her hind legs were bad, the thick fur matted with dried and fresh blood. If they didn't stop the bleeding, she wouldn't last much longer. Margaret had spent years in the wild, but she wasn't a veterinarian. She had never treated a grizzly before. But she had to try. She knew there was a first aid kit in her pack, stocked with enough supplies for a human, but for a grizzly, it would barely be enough. She rummaged through the bag, pulling out bandages, antiseptic, and a small roll of gauze. It wasn't much, but it was something. Margaret slowly inched closer to the mother bear, her heart pounding. She knew this was crossing the line. No matter how much pain the bear was in, she was still a wild animal. She could attack at any moment. Margaret took a deep breath and whispered, "Just let me help." The mother bear's dark eyes fluttered open. For a single, breathless moment, their gazes locked. Margaret felt paralyzed. Was this it? Would she lash out? Would she run? But then something incredible happened. The mother bear blinked slowly and then rested her head back down. She was letting her help. Margaret's hands trembled as she grabbed the gauze, quickly pressing it against the deep wounds. The cubs watched closely, their tiny heads tilting as they took in every move. She worked fast, carefully wrapping the bear's legs, pressing firmly but gently to stop the bleeding. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to a real medical treatment. But it would buy time. The bear let out a deep, exhausted sigh, her body still too weak to move. But Margaret could see it in her eyes now, she understood. Margaret stepped back, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cold. The worst was over. For now. But the danger wasn't. She still hadn't been able to call for backup. The flare she had shot into the sky was her only hope. But she had no idea if anyone had seen it. And then a sound cut through the forest. Margaret went still. The cubs froze, their ears twitching. It was faint, but she heard it. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Humans. Margaret's blood ran cold. Poachers. She turned back to the bear, whispering under her breath, "We're not safe yet." She grabbed her radio one last time, praying for a signal. This wasn't just about saving the bear anymore. This was about all of them surviving the night. Margaret's breath came slow and controlled, though her heart pounded like a war drum inside her chest. The footsteps were growing closer. Too close. She glanced at the cubs, who had pressed themselves against their mother's wounded body, their little heads twitching toward the sound. Their instincts told them the same thing hers did. They were in danger. Margaret grabbed her radio again, turning the dial, whispering urgently, "Dispatch, this is Ranger Miller. I need immediate backup. Possible poachers in the area. Repeat, armed poachers in the area." Static. She clenched her jaw. Still no signal. That meant she was on her own. Margaret moved quickly but silently, shifting into a defensive position near a fallen log. She was trained for situations like this, but usually with other rangers, a radio connection, and the ability to call for law enforcement. Here, she had a flare gun, a knife, and a mother bear too weak to defend her cubs. She knew what these poachers were after. They had already trapped the mother. Now that they were returning, they'd expect an easy kill. And when they saw Margaret standing between them and their prize, they wouldn't hesitate to remove her from the equation. She could hear them now, two voices, gruff and low, speaking in hushed tones. Then a flashlight beam cut through the trees. Margaret dropped to one knee, pressing herself against the ground. Through the darkness, she could just barely make out two men, both dressed in heavy camouflage jackets, their boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. One of them carried a hunting rifle, the other had a large duffel bag slung over his shoulder, likely full of supplies for processing animal parts, evidence of an illegal poaching operation. Margaret's stomach twisted with anger. These weren't just hunters. These were criminals. The taller man scanned the area with his flashlight. "You sure this is the right spot?" he muttered. The other man grunted. "Yeah, the traps were set right over there." Margaret's hands curled into fists. They had come back to finish what they started. She could feel the cubs pressed against her legs now, their tiny bodies shaking. The mother bear let out a low, weak growl, barely audible but full of instinctual warning. The flashlight swept closer. Margaret had seconds to decide. She could try to stay hidden, let them leave, or she could stop them here. She chose option 2. Margaret stood up fast and fired the flare gun. The explosive burst of red light shot into the sky, blinding the men for a moment. "What the hell?" one of them shouted, staggering back. Margaret stepped forward, her voice sharp and commanding. "U.S. Park Ranger. Put your weapons on the ground and step away from the area." The taller man cursed under his breath. The one with the rifle didn't lower it. Margaret's heart pounded, but she didn't show fear. She couldn't. "This is a protected area," she continued, her tone hard as steel. "You're under arrest for illegal poaching." The men didn't move. Instead, the one holding the rifle let out a slow, amused chuckle. "Lady, I don't think you understand." Then, before he could finish, a deep, guttural growl rumbled behind Margaret. She didn't have to turn around to know what had just happened. The mother bear had stood up. The two men went rigid. The flashlight beam trembled in their hands as they stared past Margaret. Behind her, the mother grizzly, despite her injuries, despite her exhaustion, was rising to her full, towering height. Her massive frame blocked out the trees, her deep brown eyes locked onto the poachers. The cubs let out soft, high-pitched cries, pressing themselves against her legs. Margaret could feel the shift in the air. This was no longer a battle of strength or weapons. This was a moment of pure, primal justice. The taller poacher swallowed hard, his hands shaking. "You said the bear would be dead by now," the other whispered, stepping back. "Shut up." Margaret took a slow step forward, her voice cold as ice. "Last chance. Drop the weapon." The poacher hesitated. Then he made the worst mistake of his life. The man raised his rifle. Margaret's finger hovered over the bear spray at her belt. She wouldn't let him fire. But before she had to make a move, the grizzly did. With a deep, bone-shaking roar, the mother bear lunged forward, her massive paws slamming into the ground with earth-shaking force. It was not an attack. It was a warning. A reminder that this was her forest. That they had made a mistake by ever thinking they owned it. The poacher with the rifle staggered backward, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to go." "Now," his partner yelled, already turning to run. The taller man didn't hesitate this time. He dropped the rifle and bolted after him. Margaret didn't chase them. She knew they wouldn't get far. Backup would be coming soon. Instead, she turned back to the mother bear. She was still standing. Tall. Powerful. Despite her wounds. Her breathing was heavy. The cubs were huddled against her. Then, slowly, her gaze met Margaret's. And in that moment, Margaret knew. This bear wasn't just any wild animal. She understood. She knew Margaret had saved her. And maybe, just maybe, she had saved Margaret too. The forest had gone silent again. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. The kind that comes after a storm. Margaret stood still, her breath heavy, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. The mother bear remained standing, her powerful frame still casting a shadow over the frost-covered earth. But the danger was gone. The poachers had fled, and their rifle lay abandoned in the dirt. Margaret's radio crackled to life. "Ranger Miller, this is dispatch. We saw the flare. Units are en route to your location. What's your status?" She exhaled sharply, pressing the button. "Situation under control. Suspects fled south. Injured bear still needs medical attention. Stand by for coordinates." As she spoke, she turned her gaze back to the mother grizzly. Her body was still weak. Her wounds still fresh. But she was standing. Against all odds. She was standing. Her cubs were huddled beneath her, their small frames pressed into the warmth of her legs. Margaret should have stepped back. She should have let nature take over, but something inside her, something primal, something ancient, told her to stay. For what felt like an eternity, Margaret and the bear locked eyes, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A thank you. A moment of pure understanding that transcended words, species, even logic. Margaret had saved her, and in return, the grizzly had stood beside her, had defended her, had chosen to trust her. That was something no textbook could explain. The distant hum of ATVs and sirens finally shattered the silence. Margaret turned, spotting the approaching fleet of park rangers and wildlife officers, their vehicles carving tracks into the frost-covered earth. The mother bear's ears twitched. Margaret could see the tension in her muscles, the instinctual urge to protect her cubs, to flee, to fight. Margaret took a slow step back and spoke softly. "It's okay. They're here to help." The grizzly's breath came out in a long, slow exhale. And then, with one last lingering look, she turned. The cubs scrambled after her, their tiny paws barely making a sound as they disappeared into the trees. Margaret didn't stop them. She knew they'd be okay now. The forest had claimed them back. Within minutes, the scene became a blur of activity. Rangers secured the area, collected evidence, and set out on snowmobiles to track the poachers. Margaret stood off to the side, watching as they documented the illegal traps, the rifle, the blood-stained earth where the bear had fought for survival. A fellow ranger, Jake Turner, approached her. "Miller," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You just took down a poaching operation by yourself." Margaret exhaled, her breath visible in the cold air. "I didn't do it alone." Jake followed her gaze to the trees where the grizzly had disappeared. He didn't question it. He just nodded. Because some things can't be explained. They just are. The forest had returned to its natural rhythm. Margaret stood beside the smoldering fire pit, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as she gazed into the dense Montana wilderness. The morning air was crisp, fresh, and alive once again. The past 48 hours felt surreal. She had followed 2 cubs into the unknown, uncovered a brutal poaching operation, stood face to face with armed criminals, and witnessed an injured grizzly defy death itself. And yet, as she stood there, she knew that this was only the beginning. The poachers had been caught. Thanks to Margaret's flair and detailed report, rangers had tracked the men down by the river, where their truck had gotten stuck in the mud during their escape. They had been arrested on charges of illegal trapping, firearm possession in a restricted area, and attempted trafficking of wildlife. But the real victory wasn't in their arrest. It was in what had been saved. The mother grizzly had vanished into the wild with her cubs, but her story wasn't over yet. Over the next few weeks, Margaret monitored every reported bear sighting in the area. She worked with wildlife biologists to track patterns, hoping for any sign of the bear she had saved. Then, one evening, just before sundown, she found what she was looking for, a set of tracks. Large paw prints followed by two smaller ones. Margaret's chest tightened. They were alive. And more than that, they were learning. The prints showed an unusual pattern. The mother bear had stopped near a riverbank where another trap had been set, one she had avoided. Not only that, but she had changed course, guiding her cubs away. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Could it be possible? Had she remembered? Had she taught her cubs what she had learned? It defied everything science said about animal behavior. Bears relied on instinct, not memory. But Margaret had seen too much to ignore the truth. This bear was no ordinary grizzly. She had trusted Margaret. And in return, Margaret had given her a reason to survive. Months passed, and whispers of the survivor began to spread through the park. Campers, hunters, and rangers alike spoke of a massive grizzly, one with deep scars on her back legs, who had been seen leading her cubs through the highlands. But the most remarkable part? She was avoiding human traps. Not just by accident. She was teaching other bears to do the same. Margaret sat in the ranger station one evening, reading through the latest reports, when an older biologist, Dr. Thompson, placed a folder in front of her. Inside were trail cam photos of the bear. Clear as day, she saw her again, standing tall, her cubs now older, stronger. Margaret's breath caught as she flipped to the last page. A recent sighting, near the very spot where she had saved her. The mother bear had returned. Not for help. Not out of desperation. Just to be seen. Margaret closed the folder and looked toward the darkening forest beyond the window. Somewhere out there, beneath the endless sky, a legend was walking. And Margaret knew, deep in her soul, she would never forget her. Because some stories, some bonds, some miracles, they never die. Some stories change the way we see the world. If this one touched your heart, remember, animals are far more intelligent, resilient, and connected to us than we ever imagined. What do you think? Can animals truly learn from us? Let us know in the comments. If you love stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so we can bring you more incredible stories of survival, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and wildlife. Subscribe. Like. Share. Let's spread stories that matter.